everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking about the political and economic impact of the Wuhan coronavirus, as well as the implications of U.S. President Donald Trump's impeachment and acquittal for America's democracy promotion credentials worldwide. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Michael Koplow about Israel's upcoming elections and why, like the two inconclusive elections last year that preceded it, the voting is likely to be a referendum on one man, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Freddie, we said in the past that Netanyahu has almost like a mythological immortality in terms of politics in Israel, and how on a number of occasions it seemed like that was going to come to an end. He's now up for re-election while having been indicted, and still it's too close to call.
Yeah, I think I've lost track of how many lives Netanyahu has, or how many he's exhausted up to this point.
He has an amazing ability to survive postmortems. All right. Turning to today's topics, starting with the Wuhan coronavirus. It's about a month after the first reports of people getting sick from a new and mysterious virus in central China started emerging. I looked back on our WPR Newswire, and the first time we mentioned it was on January 8th, when it still hadn't been named and it was still very mysterious. Since then, a lot of the coverage has focused on China's handling of the outbreak. There have been some compliments, but also some recriminations now over transparency, shock and surprise, and then questioning of these massive citywide quarantines of Wuhan and other major urban centers. Elliot interviewed Jeremy Yude about the public health response, both by China and the World Health Organization. But now we're kind of getting into a second phase where these second-order effects are starting to come into clearer focus. There's already been the impact on economic activity, whether it's factory production in China or the resulting disruption to supply chains. Major airlines started suspending flights to and from China. And then this week, it seemed to ratchet up a level. The Trump administration announced that it would refuse entry to any foreign nationals who had recently been in China. As surprising as it was, in many ways, it's almost to be expected at a time when securing borders has become such a hot button issue and such a central focus of the Trump administration. But at the same time, as Frida Gittes put it in her column today, viruses don't see borders.
No, they don't, although that's not having much an effect on the Trump administration's thinking, or probably for that matter, similar, right-wing or far-right governments in Europe that will probably try to put in place similar restrictions if their track record on refugees and migrants is any indication. As Frida pointed out, and also as Stuart Patrick pointed out in a recent column as well, the WHO is basically saying, you shouldn't do this, that travel restrictions, especially ones that are this sweeping, are really counterproductive and unnecessary because they impose economic costs and other burdens. And, just in the current situation today, they're not going to limit the spread of something like coronavirus, which, as Stuart put it in his piece, they can spread with the speed of a jet around the world very quickly. And already, the virus, while it remains confined to China largely, I mean, the vast majority of cases are still in mainland China. If you look at a map that various news outlets have about tracking where the cases have cropped up, you can see it slowly making its way out into other parts of the world. I think officially it's not at pandemic status yet because it's not a epidemic in multiple regions or continents, which I think is technically the at least the WHO's definition of a pandemic. But it isn't hard to see it getting there. And the Trump administration's travel restrictions, as Ben Wilhelm also pointed out in his China Note column, could get in the way of actually some productive cooperation between China and the U.S. recently about trying to contain the virus and at least share information, the kinds of things that, despite the state of ties between the U.S. and China and the backdrop of the trade war, all signs up till now have indicated that there has been pretty good cooperation over coronavirus.
And I was going to say it's important to emphasize that there has been that cooperation. China's been pretty forthcoming to work with the WHO, and after initially refusing the offer of assistance from U.S. experts, has accepted it. And I guess more broadly, this seems almost like a metaphor for the way in which so many of the threats that face the world these days are transnational, and how they sort of flout this attempt by some of the more identity-based or nationalist-based movements in various countries to seal themselves off and to try to become an island to the world. I'm thinking there's climate change, for instance. There's organized crime and trafficking, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, to say nothing of pollution and emissions. And so this almost seems like this perfect metaphor for the futility of trying to seal oneself off from the world, but also, as you said, the counterproductive nature of it. At the same time, I can't help but wonder, it seems futile now, and over the past 20 years, say, or even starting earlier than that, as globalization really started taking hold and transport, and especially air travel, became more and more accessible. It certainly seems like an aberration in that context, but I wonder, for instance, when you try to imagine what the future looks like in a world where climate change is being addressed perhaps more rigorously, and where air travel and fossil fuel usage might be more limited, and there might be less mobility, how reactions like this might become more the norm than an aberration, and what that says about our ability to continue to cooperate in conditions where not only is there are there these political incentives to close off borders, but actually there's less mobility and less interaction among people in general.
I think there's a lot of political incentive to adopt, this hard border mentality, whether it's, as we saw a few years ago at the refugee and migrant crisis in Europe, and this is just the latest example that given the backlash against certain elements of globalization, and just given the sort of nationalist fervor that is rising in a lot of countries, that in many ways explains Donald Trump's election here in the U.S., but also Brexit and a whole bunch of other governments that are far more sort of reactionary and close-minded than people thought 10 or 20 years ago, and certainly when sort of projecting the future, thinking that everything will just become more integrated and more open, it's at least politically speaking gone in the opposite direction, but it flies in the face of the reality and trends, and whether that is a global health crisis like coronavirus, or whether that's climate change, walls and travel bans and other, hard restrictions that are trying to seal off countries from each other and from the rest of the world. They're going to be futile. Whether it's this virus or effects of climate change, there isn't any respect for borders. And I think that's why a lot of these steps seem to me just to be more political than anything else. I think that probably, like most governments, the U.S. government is wary of trying to manage, obviously, the health aspects of this outbreak, but also Trump and the Trump administration is probably trying to avoid any potential political, hit that it might take if there is if there's an outbreak in the United States. The sort of irony here, of course, is that during the Ebola outbreak, Trump
I was about to mention that, how that was politicized in 2014.
Exactly. Trump and a large part of probably his base, certainly the sort of more extreme wings of the Republican Party, they went out of their way to try to blame Obama somehow for Ebola and for not sealing off America from the Ebola crisis. So it's, this is the these realities are if anything going to become more and more pressing, and I think it's just more of the sort of sense that these more restrictionist political movements are ultimately futile, but also sort of pointless in that sense, because they're just trying to delay what is inevitable. You can't contain these kinds of things.
At the same time, the political logic is understandable, because politicians rarely pay a cost for extremist reactions to try to keep people safe, even if they go against the expert recommendations. If they end up being overblown and exaggerated and unnecessary, there's little cost. Whereas they will pay a cost if they are perceived to not do enough, and there are any implications or any negative outcomes. I guess my last thought too is the thinking of Kim Elliott's column from I think last week, in which she spoke about the World Bank's projections for economic growth in 2020, and how all things considered, even the modest gains that they expected on a global level were very fragile and vulnerable to unexpected or unpredictable events. And this strikes me as being the kind of black swan event. For now, we don't know how it will play out, but it's easy to imagine, at the very least, it having an impact on growth, whether in China or worldwide. Already there's been some announcements by the U.S. to limit expectations about China's promised purchases, expanded purchases of U.S. goods and commodities under the Phase 1 trade deal that was just signed. And so already you can imagine outcomes where this could be the deciding factor that tilts things from very sluggish but slight growth into a global recession that could have political implications in various countries around the world as well.
Yeah, that was the other point that Frida pointed out in her column this week about, given how integrated China is into the global economy, and obviously how essential it is, especially to supply chains, that a downturn in China's economic activity, there was already a slowdown, but now if it accelerates because of this outbreak, that will have implications around the world for countries that rely on exporting their commodities to China, places like Chile and other countries like that, but also the U.S., which is a huge trading partner with China. And Trump, of all people, obviously is touting his economic record, and even a slight tick downward in U.S. GDP projection this year. Frida points out, that will come into play in some form or another in the election later this year. So the implications are they're pretty extensive, or they could be at least.
That gives us a pretty smooth seg into Trump's impeachment and acquittal. It's clearly a domestic story. We've spoken about it in the past a few times. I believe we spoke about the Mueller investigation, and then more recently when the revelations about Ukraine started coming out. Both of us expected it to be a lot more damning for Trump in terms of the politics. Clearly, there's the revelations are damning. But similar to Netanyahu, he survived the premature postmortems and was acquitted this week in the Senate, with one obviously major symbolic defection by Mitt Romney, a Republican senator. But what I wanted to talk about today was more the international perception of it, and particularly this idea of whether it tarnishes the U.S.'s image as a defender and promoter of democracy. I saw someone on Twitter the other day mention how if similar accusations had been proven against a president of, say, a developing country, and they were basically thrown out by his party in a partisan vote, we might expect to see the State Department putting out a declaration about democratic backsliding and warning the country about potential implications for ties with the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think even before impeachment, every sort of step of the Trump administration and every sort of most egregious thing that Trump has done, you can imagine it in another context. Say it's in an African country, and there's lots of stories about an entrenched president who has ordered the public prosecutor to investigate his rivals, or has fired the public prosecutor because he wouldn't do his bidding, and then refused Parliament's investigations, and then basically railroaded other investigations or attempts to look into his shady business deals. I mean, there's lots of elements of the Trump presidency that if the perspective were different, it's not hard to see that it would seem a little more stark in terms of just the reality of what the situation is, really, but also that the U.S. in other circumstances would be criticizing it. I think that certainly the State Department under Mike Pompeo is not about to do that, but I do think that on the one hand, there's sort of the very particular and sort of unique sides of American democracy, and I think that the specifics of impeachment and just how it is how it's laid out in the Constitution and what the process entails is obviously slightly complicated, and I think just for an international audience, it isn't quite. I think some of the sort of some of the intricacies of American politics and of the Constitution maybe muddy the waters a little bit. Also, just the fact of, but I think more importantly, just how partisan it was makes it a little more confusing, and I think that the impression internationally, at least, and I'm curious what the sort of coverage in the UK or in France looks like, that I think that there's sort of just this view that obviously Trump is only still in power, still in office because the Republican Party is completely has his back, and that in another country, in another circumstance, certainly in a parliamentary system, the party wouldn't be necessarily quite as enthralled to the prime minister. They would just replace the prime minister with someone else. In the U.S. system, obviously, it's certainly different than that. But I think that more than anything, internationally at least, that's the harm. That it's not just Trump and the abuse of power that even some Republican senators say was proven in the House manager's case, but that most of the Republican senators didn't care, or that they were willing to look past that. And I think that's the larger sort of democratic hit internationally.
I think that I think it's easy to assume that observers around the world are sort of enthralled by American democracy, or have a real, or that they see it through rose-tinted lenses. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think a lot of people have a pretty realistic view, even if for the most part the U.S. is seen as a champion of democracy and as a champion of civil rights and freedoms. I think also, for instance, Trump's actions didn't fool anyone. For instance, in Ukraine, I remember during the testimony, there was one remark by one of President Zelensky's advisors who said, "Oh, I see you want us to do an investigation into the Bidens, the same kind of investigation that you tried to get us to not do anymore when it was us going after our own political enemies." So I don't think anyone had any illusions about what was being asked. But in terms of that broader look at American democracy, up until 40, 50 years ago, and during the Cold War, when the U.S. was supposedly the champion of liberty and the free world, Black Americans were denied their civil rights, and including voting rights, and everyone knew that. Everyone understood that. It was very clear that there was a built-in hypocrisy in the message then. Even since then, if you assume, and even if you assume that foreign observers don't have as granular a look at the way in which voting rights are often constrained or inscribed, circumscribed, by various practices within the states. In France, for instance, when they find out that election day is on a Tuesday, they often express bewilderment, because in France the election day is Sunday, when pretty much no one is working and people are free to go to the polls without, for instance, waiting online and losing a day of work or losing a morning of work. So there are even just sort of mundane anecdotal details of democracy from one country to another that are perceived differently than they might be in the home country. I think with regard to parliamentary democracy also, it sort of depends. I think you're right in a strictly parliamentary system where there is a tradition and norms of rule of law. So, for instance, I don't think a British prime minister could survive at the head of a party if they were accused of the things Trump's been accused of, and certainly not if they were proven. I think, for instance, when you look at some of the post-Soviet states where it's less established rule of law, you have pretty corrupt people that manage to stay in power because they control the party. And then I think France is a hybrid. It's a hybrid presidential parliamentary system. So there, it really comes down to how expendable the prime minister is for the president. Oftentimes, they'll get rid of a prime minister in order to get rid of a domestic problem. So I think all of those things combine to make the foreign perception of American democracy perhaps a less idealized than we might imagine in the U.S. But I think a lot of that is complicated now because most countries or a lot of countries that the U.S. has pressured in terms of democracy and rule of law have often taken it to be nagging and annoying. And so now there's this pretty easy comeback, which is, well, get your own house in order and then come nag us about it.
And I mean, the thing that I keep coming back to also with Trump is that, if there's been specific instances, pick the country, for example, whether it was a post-Soviet state or a U.S. ally in Latin America or an African country, that sort of there are maybe specific instances that sort of match Trump's circumstances, whether it was abuse of power or allegations of corruption or conflicts of interest with their business ties. I mean, some things that certainly have become very familiar to entrenched and certainly authoritarian leaders. But the idea that that the U.S. and all of those things would be particularly in Eastern Europe, for example, or Central Asia, countries that were still close to Russia. It was often, certainly before Trump at least, familiar that the U.S., that Washington would criticize corruption, for example, in those governments, or criticize the sort of hold that oligarchs had over the government, even if they weren't formally in a position of power. And, putting together a handful of different issues that I know Trump's impeachment was specifically just about Ukraine, but even that whole episode involved a lot of different issues and a lot of the different things that Trump, not just norm breaking, but violations of office, that it's sort of this combination of all of these things that previous U.S. administrations have criticized other countries for. So I do think, it exposes some of that hypocrisy, but I also think that for other countries, it's sort of this sense of, well, we were getting criticized by the, State Department officials for this one thing, or because we weren't tackling corruption, or because we had a president who was, asserting too much authority over the judiciary or something. And I think that it's very easy for them now to say, well, Trump's getting away with this, and this, and this, and a much longer kind of laundry list of things. And I think that is part of certainly the probably frustration and kind of bewilderment here in the U.S. even that Trump is still getting away with all of it.
There was a period right after Trump was elected when I think we might even have mentioned it on the podcast, where there was this idea that in a lot of ways regimes like the Gulf states or Central Asia would have an advantage in dealing with the Trump administration because they were so familiar with how it worked. You had the family surrounding him, the son-in-law and the daughter in the inner circle of advisors. There was a clear route for corruption with regard to staying in Trump's Washington hotel, things like that. So it was almost like a joke that they'll feel more comfortable than, for instance, European allies or other countries that have operated more conventionally with U.S. administrations. And now this is that the punchline is seeming less and less funny and more tragic and even dramatic with these latest developments. One last element of this, and again, I think it's important to really make the distinction between, for instance, throwing critics and human rights advocates in prison and throwing journalists in prison, which happens around the world, whether in Turkey, Central Asia, Latin America. There's often killings and things like that. And to really draw a line and make a distinction that what we're talking about in the U.S. With regard to a lot of these things is an erosion of the norms. But I think it would be important to mention the erosion of the norms around the press and the role of the press, which began with Trump repeatedly and endlessly labeling the media fake news and enemies of the people. And more recently, you had this fallout from an interview between an NPR reporter, Mary Louise Kelly, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where he objected to a line of questioning, mainly because he couldn't really answer it very well. And he later berated her off mic, then accused her of having revealed what he claimed was off-the-record remarks. And then subsequently removed the NPR correspondent from the State Department plane that was taking him on a tour of Europe and Central Asia. And very pointedly, when he got to Kazakhstan, he was questioned by a reporter for Radio Free Europe about the message all that sends to countries where press freedom is really a question of life and death. And so I think that there too we have another element where the U.S. has tarnished its credentials on an issue where in the past it had been a real champion, and very unnecessarily so.
Yeah, and to me, I think that episode and particularly the questions that Pompeo got in Kazakhstan really just sort of underscored that the exchange with NPR and just the sort of really just theatrics basically from Pompeo about how they tried to claim that NPR was lying and all this stuff. It was very much obviously for a domestic audience and for their base, and it was for Trump. Trump loves to have his administration, members of his cabinet, fight with the media. They think it's good for them politically here in the U.S. But it sort of underscored how their only interest there is a U.S. domestic calculation. But it does very seriously. It does have very serious implications internationally, and especially when it's the Secretary of State who is supposed to be, at least rhetorically, someone who speaks out and advocates for press freedom. Because, as you said, it isn't just a question of access or respect for the norms of a free press. In many other countries around the world, it is a question of life and death. It's a question of whether you can report freely and fairly rather than being thrown in jail. Or, as we've seen in other countries, journalists who are killed and yet who are still praised by Trump. Thinking, for example, of Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or others who Trump has praised, even though their record on press freedom, among other records when it comes to democracy and human rights, are also not good. But I think that was just really underscored why for Trump and for Pompeo, they don't project any really interest in that part of American America's place in the world, that it matters, that the U.S. should promote these things. And obviously, certainly, yeah, there is a history of U.S. hypocrisy, and it was always, in some cases, rhetoric that didn't always match the reality of U.S. policy. But when you have the Secretary of State doing what Pompeo did and continuing to do it, and continuing to be unable to answer hard questions from reporters just because he can't answer them, that does have an impact on reporters in other parts of the world that is certainly is serious.
I'm glad you mentioned the question of the hypocrisy, because I was going to say as my final thought before we move on to the WPR articles that certainly there's the reality that throughout the Cold War and even more recently, the U.S. has always dealt with regimes that violate human rights, that imprison journalists, kill dissidents, a whole list of in the historical record. But at the same time, it's easy in pointing to that to minimize or lose sight of the fact that even if the U.S. support for these sorts of things was at times mainly declarative, that it did make a difference when the U.S. ambassador to a repressive regime was pressing them even to release a single symbolic prisoner. And when the U.S. Secretary of State in visiting said, I want to leave with an announcement that 5 political prisoners have been released. Again, it's not in international affairs and politics. It's rarely always good outcomes and the best case scenarios. But when the U.S. ambassador can even move the needle a little bit and is willing to, that means that there are, even if it's just a question of a handful of individuals, that's a handful of individuals less that are being tortured or being imprisoned unjustly. So I think it's easy to minimize the degree to which even a declarative policy with symbolic pressure and symbolic pressures, it's a little easy to minimize that and reject it out of hand when it did have an impact at times, and sometimes a greater impact than just a handful of people. So I think the fact that that's not even happening now at all is a big loss. All right, time to flag some WPR articles for everyone listening. Freddy, which one did you have in mind?
Aaron Lund's briefing on the recent escalations in Syria, in Idlib province, where Turkey, for the first time this week, directly targeted the Syrian army. And as Aaron writes, in trying to understand what Turkey's thinking was, I mean, the attack was in response to the killing of 8 Turkish soldiers in Idlib, but there's a broader question of what this brewing battle for Idlib, which has really been brewing for quite a while, the last opposition-held province in Syria, where it's headed. And Aaron writes that Turkey's president, Erdogan, may be seeking new leverage in talks with Russia, which has positioned itself as Idlib's kingmaker.
And I'll mention this week's in-depth article by Peter Schwartzstein on the environmental challenges facing the Nile River and the implications for inhabitants across the Nile Basin. For the past decade or so, tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and its potential impact on Egypt's share of the Nile's waters have driven fears of a potential water war in the region. With the two sides having recently reached an agreement for filling the dam's reservoir, those fears have now subsided. But Peter explains that environmental degradation to the Nile caused by a century of mismanagement, population growth, urbanization, and more recently the effects of climate change is a greater cause of concern for the river and the people who depend on it for their livelihoods. In the words of one Egyptian farmer that Peter quotes in the piece, "We always thought the river could handle anything. Now we find that's not true, and we have nothing to turn to instead." All right, 2 things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected articles and a rundown of everything else we've published, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount if you decide you'd like to take the next step and subscribe to WPR. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can always email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? Freddy, what have you got for me?
All right, I'm going to take the country out of this quote, and you may not get the person, but the government or country in question would be fine. Here it is. This executive order gives voice to the 99%, the ordinary people who do not like what our government has been building.
Oh, it's a tough one. Executive order seems like it would be referring to the U.S., but that might be misdirection. I gotta give up on that one.
It is the U.S. This was the head of a nonprofit called the National Civic Arts Society, which has spearheaded a new Trump administration executive order, apparently called Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again, that would insist that any new government building built in Washington would have to adhere to a classical style. And there's some question about whether, A, the Trump administration really has the authority to do this, and then there's been immediate pushback from the architectural community and just historians and architects in general that the government shouldn't be in the business of mandating architectural styles.
Here goes mine. It's referring to a leader, and if you get the country involved or the leader involved, that'll be close enough. This paper is an avid supporter of all he is trying to achieve, but we cannot be an uncritical friend. Freezing out journalists because they don't agree with him makes a mockery of his message of openness.
I want to say that it sounds like it's someone talking about Pompeo, but that also seems maybe like misdirection. It could be a lot of leaders.
It's actually about Boris Johnson, who took a page out of the Trump playbook. He tried to bar certain correspondents from a press briefing at 10 Downing Street. And in response, correspondents from all the other media outlets walked out. And that statement was from the UK's Daily Mail, which has been a really ardent and avid supporter of Boris Johnson and Brexit. But even they couldn't abide by that kind of press restrictions. And so they walked out with their colleagues.
I was going to say, I remember that quote now because there was a story before the State of the Union this week that there's this, sort of very insidery Washington media tradition where the news anchors go and have a apparently off-the-record lunch with the president before his State of the Union, and Trump had apparently barred CNN from coming to this lunch, and obviously the rest of the U.S. media, all the big news anchors still went. So in contrast to their British colleagues.
No solidarity in Washington. All right. Great stuff. Thanks, Freddy.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.